thanks so much for inviting me to talk. I'm very honoured to be asked to talk in the seminar. There we go. So I've been doing research in the field of sex work now for 25 years. I was very green when I started doing this research back in 1997. I hadn't really thought much about sex work at all, but I immigrated to New Zealand and I got a job in this department where I still am on a research project which was looking at safer sex in the sex industry in New Zealand at that time. And I've just stayed with this line of research. I think I've been very privileged. I've been lucky in that when I first started doing this research, sex work was criminalised in New Zealand, and so I was able to do my research over the period of decriminalisation and beyond, and so it's been really interesting and in doing that. And I also feel very privileged to work with very fantastic partners in the Aotearoa-New Zealand Sex Workers Collective. So yes, it's been a journey for me over 25 years, and it's also been a journey for sex work in New Zealand. So what I wanted to cover today was give a very brief introduction to the research that I've done over these 25 years, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to give you my thoughts on decriminalisation and how it's worked out in New Zealand. And specifically, the main things that I think that have come out are human rights and how sex workers are now able to access their human rights in New Zealand. How decriminalisation has enabled relationship building amongst different people and the sex industry in New Zealand. I want to talk a little bit about migrant sex work and then finish off with why decriminalisation is the way to go. Well, I think decriminalisation is the way to go. But before we get started, Travis did mention in the beginning that I take a community-based participatory research approach to all the research that I've done. Excuse me. So I've worked in participation with the NZPC Aotearoa-New Zealand Sex Workers Collective for 25 years. I'll refer to them as NZPC. That was their original name, New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, but they've changed it now to include, to get rid of the term prostitute and use the word sex worker as its better way of representing their community. This photo was taken on their 30th anniversary in 2017. I was in the back somewhere, you can't see me. But it was a lovely celebration. You can see Catherine Healy above the word anniversary. She was one of the co-founders, Dan Catherine Healy, and is still the national coordinator of NZPC. And you'll see on a lot of the slides I put in, all the research slides, I include the Fern red umbrella. So as most of you will know, the red umbrella is a symbol of the ending violence against sex workers internationally. And NZPC have kind of Kiwified it by using one of our national emblems, the silver fern, and including that in the umbrella. So I put this on the slides just to show that this is not just my research. I work very closely with NZPC. So in this community-based participatory approach, I believe it's important that the community decides what we should be looking at. Rather than me as being an outsider saying, I think this is your problem and I'm going to do some research looking at it, they identify what the issues and problems are for them that need further research. And then we work together in terms of what questions we ask and of participants, and sometimes they're involved in the collection of the data as well. And I think that this is really important because policies, interventions or services that we develop using the findings of the research will then be more relevant to the organisation and sex workers in New Zealand. Excuse me. So I want to just talk briefly about the research that I've done, and I see it as a journey. I've been on a journey for the last 25 years. And so that very first project that I came to work on was safer sex in the Christchurch sex industry. And Christchurch is where I live. and it's the second largest city in New Zealand and has the second largest number of sex workers in New Zealand. The principal investigator on this project was Libby Plumridge. And we did the study. She'd already developed a relationship with the NZPC at that time. And sex work was criminalised, and NZPC were busy working on the bill for decriminalisation of sex work. And they wanted some evidence to support their claims about the harms which criminalisation caused. So we did a study which was fairly large. We surveyed 303 sex workers in New Zealand, which was around 81% of the estimated population at that time. And we also interviewed 32 female sex workers several times over an 18-month period, both in Wellington and Christchurch. And the overwhelming finding from this research was that criminalisation does cause a number of harms. We found that street-based sex workers experience more and more severe forms of violence than indoor sex workers. We found that sex workers were working under extremely exploitative and coercive conditions, and it was primarily because of criminalisation. So massage parlours were quite exploitative. They could fine them for very minor issues. They had to pay shift fees and work fairly long, 12-hour shifts and without being able to leave. They wouldn't allow them to refuse to see a client, and some demanded free sex themselves, sometimes without condoms. They often couldn't decide for themselves what services they would or wouldn't provide. The operators decided for them. And there was a disincentive for condoms. So condoms were used as evidence for prostitution-related activities, as they called it. And so brothel operators didn't really want condoms on the premises, and street-based workers didn't want to have them in case the police found them on them. So sex workers couldn't fight for a right for better working conditions. They couldn't report crimes committed against them to the police because obviously they'd be exposing themselves as involved in an illegal activity. And all of it made them extremely vulnerable. So we finished the study around 1999, and in 2000, the Prostitution Reform Bill was submitted to Parliament, and it spent 3 years in Parliament. There were debates, obviously there were a number of debates, and there were submissions were heard by the Select Committee. And yes, so it was in Parliament for a long time. I just want to emphasise that bill was written by NZPC. They were helped by lawyers and support workers, and it was tidied up by a professor of law at the University of Victoria in Wellington. But the evidence that was obtained in this research we did was invaluable in that debate in Parliament as to why regulation of sex work should change. And in 2003, New Zealand then became the first country to decriminalise sex work when it was passed in June 2003. New South Wales in Australia had decriminalised in 1995, but they were at that stage the only state in Australia that had decriminalised. Since then, 2 others have more recently, and this year Belgium decriminalised, but they're still too early to see any research coming out of there. So just after decriminalisation, in discussions with Catherine at NZPC, we decided we needed to put in a research proposal to explore what the impacts of decriminalisation had been, had it worked. Were sex workers safer in a decriminalised environment? And so we got funding from the Health Research Council in New Zealand to do that research. And very shortly after that, the Ministry of Justice contacted me because they had to, according to the terms of the section within the Prostitution Reform Act, the Act had to be evaluated within 5 years. So they had set up a Prostitution Law Review Committee, and they thought our research would be quite valuable in informing that evaluation. So They gave us extra money to produce a report for them, and also to extend our data collection. So in that study, we surveyed 772 sex workers and did in-depth interviews with 57 sex workers across the 3 major cities in New Zealand, Christchurch, Auckland and Wellington, as well as 2 smaller cities. And yes, we found that the research that sex workers had greater control over their working environment than they previously had, and they were able to utilise the law. The recognition of their human rights meant that their relationship with the police had to improve. The police had to turn from being the enemy into being a protector, and the relationship with police had changed slightly. So after the study, we found that especially street-based workers, their relationship with police had improved because they had the most contact with police, and some of them were reporting crimes to them. And because of this, their recognition of their human rights, they were also able to respond to exploitation. They could respond to exploitative practices in brothels. They were more able to negotiate with clients over what services they would or wouldn't provide, and also around condom use. And we also found that although stigma was still an issue for sex workers, there was a perceived increasing acceptance within society. And also the Prostitution Law Review Committee, at the end of their evaluation of the Act, concluded from our findings and others that sex workers were better off under decriminalisation, and there'd been no negative outcomes. So then the next, those first 2 studies were quite large mixed method studies. The research that I've done in New Zealand since then has taken a qualitative approach. It's probably where I feel most comfortable, and also because I think it's very important to get the depth of the experiences of sex workers in terms of how they experience decriminalisation in New Zealand. So these studies were done along my journey. The first one, I looked at ex-sex workers when they left the industry. That was kind of fell out of the recommendation by the review committee to look at ways to help people leave the sex industry when they wanted to. When they wanted to was put on by the Law Review Committee, because within the Act, in terms of what the review committee had to look at, it said how we can help sex workers to cease working in the industry. And it was coming from that sort of frame that sex workers needed to be saved from working in the industry, whereas sex workers don't see it as that way. Many do choose to work in this industry. So anyway, we did do interviews with sex workers who had left sex work, and the same reasons all over, is mostly money is the chief reason for working in the industry. And a lot of people leave when they get into a personal relationship, or if they have a bad experience, but money is always the reason for returning. So the people that we worked to had left and come back a few times. I won't spend too much time on any one of these studies. Oops, sorry, let me go back to that. So the second one, I teamed up with Stephanie Wahab, who was from the University of Portland in Oregon, and she spent some time in New Zealand. She moved here for a short period of time, and she had a social work background, and she'd done some research in Oregon around young sex workers on the street. And so we kind of teamed up. We spoke to Catherine from the previous research we'd done on the impacts of the decriminalisation. We spoke to quite a few young people on the street, and a lot of street-based workers have experienced foster care, of being involved with social workers, and the relationship between them was quite fraught. So we decided we should do a little bit more work in this area. And we interviewed young people who were working on the street as well as social workers. And we found that the situation is still quite fraught for young people. They felt that there was no relationship building with social workers, that they were very stuck to the guidelines that they had to use, and they were very risk adverse, and so they felt that that at-risk label was really contested by young people, which resulted in a lack of trust and a barrier to relationship building between social workers and youth. The next stage of the sex work journey was looking at employment in the sex industry. So like most other places in the world, sex workers in brothels are independent contractors, not employees, but they are often treated like employees, but with none of the benefits of having paid holiday or sick leave. We interviewed sex workers and brothel operators in this study, but I'll expand on the findings from this research when I talk more about human rights. The next leg of the journey, we looked at work practices and safety of internet-based sex workers, and I talked to brothel operators, clients, sex work web platform providers, and sex workers as well. But I won't talk too much on that study today. The next stage of the journey, I was contacted by the Business, Immigration and Enterprise. The ministry contacted myself and Michael Roguski, who's an independent researcher, to undertake some research to look at what was happening with regard to migrant sex work in New Zealand. And we interviewed migrant sex workers and key stakeholders, and I'll talk more about that again in a little while. And finally, in the last stage, the most recent stage of my journey, I looked at street-based sex workers in the community, where we interviewed street-based sex workers, outreach workers, residents and business owners, and council staff. And again, I'll talk about that a little later as well. So getting on to human rights, I think the most important change for sex workers has been the ability to exercise human rights in New Zealand, and that has had an impact on their health and safety. There's some protections for sex workers built into the Prostitution Reform Act. Section 16, for instance, provides protection for sex workers by making it an offence. Sorry, my voice is going, but provides protection for sex workers by making it an offence with a penalty of up to 14 years imprisonment for anyone to induce or compel another person to provide or continue to provide commercial sexual services or claim any earnings derived from sex work. Individuals, therefore, aren't able to use an occupational position or prior relationship with a sex worker or threaten or bribe a sex worker to provide a sexual service. And the Act also provides for the right of refusal to provide a commercial sexual service, and consent can be withdrawn at any stage in the transaction. And these sections were designed to protect sex workers against exploitative management practices, such as the use of bribes or threats to provide particular sexual services. However, these sections can also provide protection against clients, and we've found that as well. So brothel operators are aware of these sections under the PRA, and most of them do try and stick to the rules. They recognise that treating sex workers well was a key business strategy to retain as well as attract workers. So this one operator said, I mean, one of the reasons why the girls like working for us is they can work as hard as they want or as little as they want. We're now in a normal working environment. They can at my place, they work whatever hours they decide. They take breaks whenever they want. If they don't like a customer, they don't see them. There's no penalty, no nothing. There's a customer that they don't particularly like, we won't book them again for them. I mean, they call the shots. They're an independent person. We can't control them in any way except for the quality of our business. The hours they work, the things they don't have to kiss if they don't want to kiss, but that's all up to them. So they recognised that treating sex workers was good, and only one operator I spoke to actually admitted to fining, but they all talked about the frustration of struggling to run a business when they talked about how the power shift had happened, and they felt that sex workers had all the power and they struggled to run their business because they couldn't force them to come to their shifts. So they would have so many people on a shift, but if some people just didn't pitch up and they couldn't find them or do anything like that, then they didn't have enough people on the premises for the clients for that night. So they talked about those frustrations of struggling to run a business. And although some of them did try and sort of insist that they come in, and although some sex workers indicated, that they felt that these were exploitative practices and they were still happening within brothels, overall they felt that management was good and in most cases respectful. There's exploitation in all industries. It's not unique to sex work. But I think what came out of decriminalization was the ability to do something about it, whereas before they couldn't do anything about it. Now they've actually got the ability, and they do use it, and that ability, and they do stand up for themselves. This was one sex worker who said, actually, I'm not really feeling very well, so I'm not going to come in today. And the operator said, if you don't here, then you'll have to reimburse us our share of the cost. She said, that's clearly trying to pressure me into having sex when I didn't want to. I left and I texted her and I said, you should try running your business within the law because it's illegal for you to try and pressure me into work when I don't want to. So there's a wide understanding of the human rights, and they do utilize it. So often when they have problems with a brothel operator, they will talk to NZPC, and NZPC often do a mediation between sex workers and brothel operators to try and come to an understanding, and do a lot of work in educating brothel operators as to what they can and cannot do. And NZPC are a good, they're a good resource for both operators and sex workers. These are news sex worker wanted to pursue to the Human Rights Tribunal, and both were sexual harassment cases. So the first one that happened, I actually interviewed this sex worker in the employment study. And she talked about how he was making the operator was making these unwelcome and suggestive comments, despite her repeatedly asking him to stop just commenting on what she was wearing and coming up behind her all the time. And although he didn't touch her or anything, she felt harassed by the language he was using. And so she decided to pursue it onto the Human Rights Tribunal, where the tribunal then awarded her $25,000. And the findings of the tribunal emphasised that sex workers should not be treated differently to any other workers. So the director of the human rights proceedings stated, context is everything. Even in a brothel, language with the sexual dimension can be used inappropriately in suggestive, oppressive or abusive circumstances. Sex workers are as much entitled to protection from sexual harassment as those working in other occupations. The fact that a person is a sex worker is not a license for sexual harassment, especially by the manager or employer at the brothel. And when I spoke to the sex worker, she said that she had pursued it because she felt that it would give other sex workers the confidence to report similar matters if she proceeded with charges. In the other case, the sex worker took a case of sexual harassment against the brothel operator, also for sexual harassment. And it was settled, the operator had other businesses and he didn't want his name in the media. So he settled before the case was finished. And he, with $250,000. And again, the director of the human rights proceedings stated that the settlement was an important reminder to businesses that all workers, regardless of the type of work they do, have the right to freedom from sexual harassment in the workplace. We encourage all business owners and employers to ensure that they understand and respect those rights. So the rights are being upheld within the Human Rights Tribunal as well as in the courts. So some clients have been taken to court. I've just got 3 examples here. Of sex workers who have used section 16 and 17. In the first case, the Wellington man was convicted of rape for removing his condom without the sex worker's consent. And this was the first case of stealthing, which went to court and was successful in getting a conviction on rape. The other one was, the next one was a police officer who pursued a street-based sex worker, and he knew that she had outstanding traffic fines and said that he would arrest her for not paying the fines unless she had sex with him. And she did, but then she told NZPC afterwards, and they said, well, it's not on, you don't, that shouldn't happen. So they helped her in reporting it to the police, and he was jailed for sex extortion under section 16 and 17 of the Act. And the last example I've got there is of a client who was convicted of assault. The sex worker had agreed to rough sex, but the client went beyond what she had consented to. And again, he was jailed for not stopping after she had changed her mind. Section 17 says that you consent to something, but you can always withdraw that consent. She withdrew her consent, and he didn't stop. So I just wanted to also point out that if you look at the wording, the terms used in the reports in these newspaper headlines, so going back to the previous slide and this one, sorry, not that one. The term sex worker is more commonly used now in New Zealand in reporting in the media. So there was, this has changed even more from, just after the Prostitution Reform Act was passed, there was still a lot of the use of the term prostitute in reporting, but it's changed now. The language is changing, which is a good sign and also sometimes it doesn't even mention the sex workers' occupation. In the top two headlines here, it's there's no mention that the person was a sex worker at all in the headlines, which is again is a huge step forward in terms of the stigma, addressing stigma attached to sex work. There was also human rights in the pandemic, because when the lockdown happened and people who lost their jobs or who weren't paid during the lockdown were able to access a government subsidy. And because sex work is decriminalised, sex workers were also entitled to that, that government subsidy for lost earnings. There were still a lot of clients who tried to contact them, and I just put these two here, and I don't know if you can read them, but they, the first one says, the client said, "Hey, you busy? I'm busy answering inquiries regarding the phone and text services I'm providing. Are you busy?" Said, "Not busy at the moment, keen to come over, got cash." And she said, "Okay, meet you in 30 minutes at 135 Dalton Street," which was the address of the police station. And the next one, he wanted sex, and she said, "You're about the 20th person that's tried to book a full service. Can you imagine how many bubbles that breaks? Can you imagine how many germs that spreads? Can you imagine how many people it's putting at risk?" Kind of hoping that something like coronavirus would take the morons out first, but it doesn't seem like that's happening. So sex workers' rights, but before decriminalisation, the relationship police was non-existent. I said before that they were the enemy. And when we did that study 5 years after enactment, we noted some changes. Sex workers, particularly on the street, were more confident in reporting violence and other incidents to the police, but there was still a bit of reticence. But since then, confidence in police has been growing. The New Zealand, the NZPC have engaged with police in all the major centres. They provide workshops to police on how to deal with sex workers reporting crimes in order to put them at ease. They worked with police in producing a resource for sex workers who've experienced sexual violence. This booklet that was jointly put together reinforces that sexual assault is any sexual act that's not consented to. It's including if they had previously agreed and then changed their mind. It also reinforces to sex workers that sexual assault is not an occupational hazard, but a crime. It's not their fault and they shouldn't blame themselves. And this was the foreword, I won't read it out because of my voice, foreword that the district commander in Wellington wrote in this booklet. So sex workers who've reported sexual assault to the police have been very positive about the reporting process. This one on the left, this quote from a sex worker said she asked NZPC if they could help her. The police officer met me at the police station lobby, which was great. I could bypass reception. The police officer was very reassuring regarding my concerns about having to go to court and about the person who'd done this finding me or finding out that I went to the police. And one of the community liaison workers with NZPC said about helping a sex worker. I went out to the place where the assault happened, picked her up. She'd never gone to the police, was quite scared. We were in the police station. I pulled out the booklet and the police officer goes, no, that's all right. We know about that resource. We're all aware of that resource and the process of working with sex workers. So sex workers, as I said, have done workshops. They've done workshops on stealthing so that police are aware of, that consent and sex work, and they're aware of section 16 and 17 in the Act. It's not possible to develop these type of relationships if you aren't working in a decriminalized environment. And also, it's not possible to develop relationships with others, like medical officers of health and other agencies that are there to uphold workplace rights. And if these agencies don't have a good understanding of sex work culture, there's a risk that they can deter engagement rather than encouraging it. So under the Prostitution Reform Act, medical officers of health were designated as inspectors of brothels. But when we did the study 5 years after enactment, they were just sort of reacting if there were complaints. They largely took a hands-off approach. But a few years ago, some brothel-based workers were unhappy with working conditions and they went to NZPC. Brothel management wasn't supporting them in terms of negotiating with clients about condom use and oral sex. And so the peers at NZPC talked to them about the actions available, including going to medical officers of health. And so the NZPC and the medical officers of health worked collaboratively, and they agreed not to identify specific brothels where this was happening, but to rather broadly engage with all the local brothels in the area. So NZPC which was sent to brothel operators, agreed for the inspectors to visit and observe what was happening on site, and how safer sex was promoted within each of the brothels. During this time, brothel operators also contacted NZPC for assistance, so it opened up more lines of communication. And the medical officers of health found that most brothels actively advised clients about safe sex policy at the point of booking. They provided information on their websites and trained sex workers to deal with clients who requested unsafe sex. Brothels that didn't adequately promote best practices did receive some follow-up. Now I'm running out of time, so I'll go on to the next one about the community. So NZPC has put a lot of effort into engaging with communities where street-based sex work happens. In the beginning, there was a lot of tension, particularly in one area of Auckland, and a working group was put together which included people in the council, police, residents, business owners, and NZPC, and they initiated a number of problems to sort of ease the to come to an agreement between both parties. So NZPC initiated an education program in Auckland to encourage street-based sex workers to keep the noise levels down and pick up the litter. One of the solutions was also to have a managed approach where sex workers sort of were on the street from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And although it was an informal curfew, nobody could enforce it. Most sex workers were happy to comply with that. And this is just one of the council staff who talked about that process and the importance of getting everybody around the table. So they were able to sort it out without having to resort to zoning or any other bylaws which can cause problems. And the community, the business owners have been quite receptive to this. These are just two people who live or work on the street where the trouble was kind of happening in Auckland, and generally they felt that having street-based sex workers there sort of gave the area a lot of vibrancy, and they welcomed it in the area. And the other one talked about having people on the street 24/7 was really valuable because it deterred a lot of other crime, a lot of crime from happening. And we know that sex workers have phoned the police when they've seen people breaking into cars and so on. Yeah, and it's about mutual respect as well. So this business owner, she owns a restaurant on K Road. She said it's about saying hi to people and having a bit of trust and a bit of recognition. And if you're respectful, you get that mutual respect happening. And a sex worker worked in that said, yeah, if everyone respected the community, I know that would play a big part in helping and sort of keeping the noise down and cleaning up. And she talks about always cleaning up after herself and how she also helps to get other sex workers to play their part in being part of the community. We also had a working group in Christchurch when, after the earthquake, a lot of the sex workers were displaced, the cordons around the city, because the city was quite dangerous. There were buildings that were which either had come down or were too dangerous to go near. And so the city was cordoned off, which displaced some of the sex workers into a suburban area. And there was a number of complaints from residents there. And the council were going to put a bylaw in place, but we worked collaboratively instead to find a solution. The council gave the NZPC 40,000 to help. There was an outreach worker who just did a lot of work encouraging people to move back across the road once the cordons came down and they could go back to their old place of work. And the residents in the end were extremely happy. Sorry, I'm rushing through these slides. In terms of what hasn't worked in New Zealand was around migrant sex work. So what the act was very simple the bill was very simple when it went into Parliament. It was basically just scrapping all the laws which criminalise sex work. But what came out was a 51 section document where were unable to work in the sex industry. They aren't able to work or own a brothel in New Zealand. This was put in out of a fear of trafficking. They thought that if that decriminalisation might mean that people would be trafficked in from outside, so they decided on putting this in, which has caused more harm than anything else. We did a study, as I said, we were commissioned by the Ministry of Immigration, Business, Immigration and Enterprise, and we found that there's a lot of exploitation going on, particularly with immigrants who can't speak English or who are visibly different from New Zealanders. They're particularly targeted by immigration, and so there's a lot of threats of not paying, unprotected sex, and we found even incidences of rape where sex workers just would not report it for fear of being deported. So that's the only negative that's come out, and that was not, it's had really unintended consequences, and we are hopeful of getting that section scrapped from the PRA soon. I think it's fairly obvious that I think decriminalisation is the way to go. Both New Zealand and New South Wales have documented the positive impact decriminalisation has had on the health and safety of sex workers. They have the same rights as any other citizen in society. They're able to use those rights. Most sex workers in New Zealand have never experienced any other legislative environment, and to them, criminalisation just seems ludicrous. The public are really unconcerned about sex work and are largely supportive of decriminalisation. Even the residents I spoke to who were severely impacted by street-based sex work in their area said that they fully supported decriminalisation of sex workers. So policy is liable to fall down when it's not acceptable to those who are affected by it because they haven't been consulted. And it's predominantly the reason for the failure of policies focused on sex work around the world. Sex workers is constructed in a way which is meaningless to most of those who work in this occupation, but the sanctions it places on them causes a great deal of harm. The best possible way to develop policy which is both acceptable and effective is to develop it in collaboration with sex workers. And lastly, I just want to say we have the message, we have the evidence there, and we just need to find more effective ways of delivering the message. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I've run a little bit over time.